Japanese troops in the Pacific had a name for United States Marines that wasn't really a compliment in the way it gets repeated today. Kichiku, devil or demon, a word with roots in older Buddhist imagery of tormenting spirits rather than any specifically military vocabulary. It wasn't coined in the comfortable distance of post-war memory, the way nations sometimes soften an old enemy into a respected rival once the shooting stops. It was used in the mud in the dark while men were actually dying, a word closer to something you mutter about a force that no longer seems to follow the ordinary rules of human endurance. Japanese wartime propaganda would later borrow and weaponize a version of the same word for a domestic civilian use, kichiku beihei, roughly American and British devils, turning a battlefield expression of genuine, specific bewilderment into a slogan meant to dehumanize an entire enemy population. That's worth separating clearly from what this story is really about, because the frontline usage predates and differs meaningfully from the propaganda version. Soldiers on Guadalcanal and Tarawa weren't reading government posters when they used the word about the specific men shooting at them. They were describing something they'd personally watched happen and couldn't otherwise explain. This isn't a story about American mythology. There's already plenty of that available. It's a story about what happens when the myth turns out to undersell the actual documented record, because the Imperial Japanese Army that first used that word wasn't made up of fools or untrained conscripts who broke at the first sign of resistance. This was an army that had taken Singapore, a fortress the British had called impregnable, in 70 days. It had driven American forces out of the Philippines. It had built in roughly 6 months an empire stretching from Burma to the edge of Alaska's outer islands. When Japanese soldiers described the Marines, they were fighting as something beyond ordinary human limits. They weren't being poetic. By their own internal reports, they were trying to be precise about a genuine tactical problem they couldn't solve. The first real test came at Guadalcanal in August 1942, a story this channel has already told detail elsewhere. The destruction of Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's assault force at the mouth of the Ilu River, roughly 800 Japanese dead against a Marine line that held. I won't retell the battle here. What matters for this story is what came immediately after it, 3 weeks later, on a ridge south of Henderson Field that would end up carrying the name of the Marine officer who defended it. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commanding the Japanese 17th Army's effort to retake Guadalcanal after Ichiki's disaster, studied the reports carefully and adjusted his own assessment of the Marine defenders upward. He sent roughly 3,000 men under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, a veteran of the brutal fighting in Borneo, who, according to several post-war accounts, arrived in the Solomons with genuine confidence in his own tactical judgment, having already led one of the more effective Japanese jungle campaigns of the war's opening year. In a coordinated night assault from 3 directions at once, timed for September 12, 1942, by any reasonable tactical standard, a considerably better plan than Ichiki's frontal charge across open sand, involving genuine coordination and genuine use of terrain. What it didn't account for was the specific ground itself, a narrow spine of coral and kunai grass rising some 250 feet above the surrounding jungle floor, or the specific character of the roughly 800 men holding it. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's Raider Battalion, reinforced by the 1st Parachute Battalion, who had spent 3 straight weeks digging in and stringing wire along that ridge before Kawaguchi's men ever appeared out of the tree line. The assault that began around midnight wasn't a single attack. It was wave after wave across roughly 9 hours of fighting, each one absorbed and pushed back at a cost to the attackers considerably heavier than to the defenders. By dawn, Kawaguchi had lost somewhere close to 1,200 men. Edson's combined force had lost 164 killed and wounded. The ridge held, the airfield held, and from that specific night to the broader strategic momentum on Guadalcanal genuinely shifted. Edson himself, known to his own men as Red Mike, for hair that had already gone gray by his early 40s, was a Vermont National Guardsman turned career Marine who'd already earned 1 Navy Cross fighting guerrillas in Nicaragua during the so-called Banana Wars of the 1920s, and a 2nd for leading the assault on Tulagi days before his own ridge fight began. He received the Medal of Honor for that September night, and went on, after the war, to spend much of his remaining career fighting a different kind of battle entirely, leading the post-war campaign in Congress to stop the Marine Corps from being folded into the Army as part of a broader military reorganization. The same institutional survival fight that had originally produced Pete Ellis's Doctrine 2 decades earlier. Edson won that fight too. He died in 1955 at 58, worn down from the strain of the very campaign that had kept his own corps alive. Japanese officers who studied the action on the ridge afterward, in surviving intelligence assessments captured later that same year and later cited in American after-action analysis, kept circling back to a specific and uncomfortable observation: that the Marine defense hadn't behaved like a force fighting out of fear, absorbing a breakthrough and then simply falling back. It had behaved in the language of at least one captured Japanese assessment, like men using violence the way a craftsman uses a tool without excess emotion, adjusted precisely to whatever the moment in front of them required. That distinction, craft rather than raw ferocity, is what genuinely unsettled Japanese analysts more than the casualty numbers themselves, because ferocity can be worn down or surprised. A trained response, repeated correctly under pressure by men who'd rehearsed exactly this kind of collapse in training, is considerably harder to counter with a better plan next time. To understand what Japanese officers were up against on that ridge, you have to understand what the Marine Corps itself had been forced to become over the 2 preceding decades, not by grand strategic vision, but by a genuine institutional survival fight. The Corps had nearly been abolished outright after the First World War. The Army considered it redundant, and Congress considered it an expense nobody could fully justify. It survived by claiming a mission nobody else particularly wanted: the seizure of fortified Pacific islands against determined defenders, a doctrine whose earliest serious blueprint traces back to a genuinely strange figure named Earl Pete Ellis, a Marine officer and self-taught intelligence operative who spent years before his own death in 1923 quietly touring Japanese-mandated Pacific islands under assumed identities, producing a 1921 planning document called Advanced Base Operations in Micronesia that predicted, with unsettling accuracy, both a coming Pacific War with Japan and the specific island-by-island amphibious campaign that would eventually be needed to win it. Ellis died under circumstances that remain murky to this day, on the island of Palau, officially of illness, though some later accounts suspected Japanese authorities of having a hand in it, given how deep into restricted territory his own solo reconnaissance had taken him. His 1921 study sat in Marine planning files for 2 decades, functioning as something close to institutional scripture by the time the actual war began, since the doctrine it called for was, at the moment, Marine planners started developing it seriously through the 1930s, purely theoretical. Nobody had ever successfully pulled off a large-scale opposed amphibious landing in the modern era. Gallipoli, the one recent large-scale attempt anyone could point to, had been a catastrophe, and the conventional wisdom across most of the world's military establishments held that operations like it were simply not survivable against a prepared defense. Through the 1930s, Marine planners studied Gallipoli and every comparable failed landing they could find archived, and built a doctrine specifically aimed at solving a problem the wider military establishment had more or less concluded was unsolvable: specialized landing craft, coordinated naval gunfire support techniques, close-quarters training. Under conditions other branches considered too extreme to run realistically. Then, in August 1942, they tested the entire theory for the first time, not in an exercise, but against combat veterans of the China campaign, with their own supply lines simultaneously being cut behind them by a catastrophic naval defeat that had sunk 4 Allied cruisers in under 40 minutes a few nights earlier. I think the actual significance of Edson's Ridge gets slightly lost if you only look at the casualty numbers, because the real strategic weight of that single night sits in what it forced Japanese command to conclude about the entire theater going forward. that the American units they'd be facing across the rest of the Pacific weren't going to behave the way pre-war assessments of the Dollar Army had predicted. That reassessment shows up again and again in later Japanese planning documents at increasing cost to figure out correctly. The Battle of Tarawa, fought over the tiny atoll of Betio in the Gilbert Islands that November 1943, represents a different kind of test entirely. Not a night ambush in jungle terrain, but a fully prepared, heavily fortified position assaulted head-on across open water. The Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki, had genuine reason for his confidence going in. His garrison, reinforced by roughly 1,000 Japanese and 1,200 Korean laborers who'd spent months under the tropical sun, converting the island into what one American planner later called an unsinkable battleship, had built 14 coastal defense guns dug into concrete positions, 40 additional artillery pieces, and something close to 500 machine gun nests connected by a continuous trench and bunker network. An entire island, barely 2 miles long and 800 yards wide, with essentially no approach that wasn't already covered by prepared fire. Shibazaki's own boast to his men, well documented across multiple post-war accounts, was that it would take 1 million men 100 years to conquer Tarawa. The Marines landed on November 20th, 1943, into fire that was catastrophic within the first minutes. Landing craft grounding on an offshore reef the American planners hadn't properly accounted for, forcing men to cross several hundred yards of open, chest-deep water on foot under direct fire from the shore the entire way. Casualties in the opening hours ran to levels that should, by any conventional military logic, have broken the assault outright. Communications broke down almost immediately. Formal unit cohesion broke down along with them, and the Marines kept moving forward anyway. Not in organized waves anymore, since those structures had largely been shredded in the water, but in ones and twos and small improvised groups pushing toward the beach through fire that should have stopped them for reasons that couldn't be traced back to any single surviving order. Colonel David Shoup, commanding the assault regiment from the shelter of a shattered landing craft turned improvised command post on the beach itself, spent the worst of the first day directing fragments of at least 4 different battalions into some kind of coherent line using little more than runners and sheer force of personality, wounded twice himself and refusing evacuation, conduct that would earn him the Medal of Honor and, decades later, a term as Commandant of the entire Marine Corps. Shibazaki himself was killed on the first day when naval gunfire found his command post directly. 76 hours after the first Marine set foot on that beach, Betio was secured. Of a garrison of roughly 4,600 Japanese troops, 17 survived to be taken prisoner. Post-war Japanese military histories analyzing Tarawa reached a conclusion that's since been widely quoted, that the Marines who crossed that reef under fire hadn't done so out of ignorance of the danger in front of them, but because their training had given them the capacity to act correctly in a situation demanding something beyond what most soldiers in most armies are actually capable of producing under that specific kind of pressure. That Japan's defensive planning had been built against the expectation of a normal battlefield behavior, and it turned out to need a different kind of defense entirely. Tarawa's own lessons, brutal as they were for the Americans who fought there, fed directly back into how every subsequent Central Pacific landing was planned for the rest of the war. New amphibious tractors capable of clearing a reef rather than grounding on it, more extensive pre-landing naval bombardment, and closer coordination between the ships offshore and the men actually crossing the beach. Adjustments that Marine planners credited, in their own post-war assessments, with meaningfully reducing the casualty rate at nearly every landing that followed. By 1945, Japanese staff officers were producing detailed technical assessments of American amphibious tactics that read, in their honesty, like documents that couldn't plausibly have been written 3 years earlier. This wasn't an isolated moment of clarity from a single analyst either. Captured Japanese unit diaries and after-action reports from across the Pacific Theater, held today in American and Japanese military archives alike, show the same basic reassessment occurring independently at dozens of separate commands over the course of roughly 3 years, each one apparently arriving at some version of the same conclusion without much coordination between them, since Japan's own internal communications between island garrisons had grown increasingly fragmented as American submarines and air power cut off the sea lanes that would otherwise have let those lessons circulate more efficiently. One Imperial Army staff study prepared that February and later captured on Okinawa described the U.S. Marine Corps in terms that amounted, in substance, to a formal concession, that its effectiveness derived not from any single weapon or tactical innovation, but from an integration of selection, training, doctrine, and accumulated institutional memory that had produced individual soldiers capable of continuing to operate effectively under conditions of near total organizational collapse, and that no defensive plan built around the assumption those conditions would degrade Marine performance the way it would degrade most other troops could be considered a genuinely sound plan at all. That's not a tactic being described. It's a system, one built, tested, and refined across roughly 2 decades of institutional self-examination, producing men who weren't simply brave, since bravery on its own is fairly common in war, but competent in a way that survived organizational disruption and kept functioning at the individual level even after everything above that individual had already been destroyed. The Battle of Iwo Jima in February and March 1945 put that same system through arguably its harshest test of the entire war, against a Japanese commander who had specifically studied the mistakes of every earlier island defense and tried to correct for them. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent time in the United States and Canada between the wars as a junior officer and later military attaché, touring army posts, studying American industrial capacity firsthand, and reportedly writing home to his family that any nation capable of producing what he was seeing on an ordinary American factory floor was not a country Japan should ever go to war against. An assessment that did nothing to stop the war from coming anyway, but that clearly shaped how seriously he took the specific enemy he'd eventually be assigned to stop. His roughly 22,000 defenders had spent 8 months building 16 miles of interconnected tunnels, dozens of blockhouses, and hundreds of mutually supporting firing positions, engineered from the start to kill Marines slowly and at maximum cost, rather than in one dramatic, doomed banzai charge. Kuribayashi had explicitly forbidden those charges, breaking with the standard Japanese defensive playbook of the previous 3 years, specifically because he'd studied how badly it had failed everywhere else. He was right about the cost. Marines took Iwo Jima in 36 days, at roughly 26,000 American casualties, including close to 7,000 killed, the only major Pacific battle in which American losses actually exceeded Japanese losses, a statistic senior American planners took seriously enough that it directly informed the far grimmer casualty projections drawn up that same spring for what an eventual invasion of the Japanese home islands would likely cost. Projections that would go on to shape the decision-making around ending the war by other means entirely a few months later. Kuribayashi's own doctrine, widely considered the single most sophisticated defensive position Japan built anywhere in the war, had achieved exactly the maximum cost he'd engineered it to achieve. It had not achieved the one outcome that actually mattered to him, which was stopping the assault itself. Peleliu that same year adds a genuinely poignant final piece to this record rather than another proof of the same pattern. The American side of that fighting has its own enduring literary record, in a memoir that's since become one of the most widely read first-hand accounts of the entire Pacific War. Eugene Sledge, a mortarman with the 1st Marine Division who fought through both Peleliu and later Okinawa, published his own recollections decades afterward as With the Old Breed, a book notable less for any single dramatic set piece than for its unflinching, almost clinical honesty about what the fighting on Peleliu's coral ridges actually did to the men living through it. Heat that reportedly reached above 115 degrees on the exposed rock, a chronic shortage of drinkable water in the campaign's opening days, and combat conditions Sledge himself described as having stripped away, for him personally, any remaining romantic notion of what this kind of fighting was actually like. His account of Peleliu specifically is often cited by historians as one of the primary reasons that campaign, despite its casualty rate and tactical significance, is remembered today with the kind of unsentimental honesty usually reserved for accounts written much closer to the actual fighting. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, defending the island beginning in September 1944, had studied essentially every earlier Marine campaign available to him and rebuilt his own defensive doctrine entirely around those lessons. No banzai charges, extensive cave systems with mutually supporting fields of fire, defense calculated in depth rather than concentrated at the beach. The 1st Marine Division's landing had originally been projected by American planners to take about 4 days. The fighting lasted 73, at some of the highest casualty rates, proportionally, of the entire Pacific War. Nakagawa's defense was, according to most post-war military assessments, the most sophisticated Japan had yet fielded against the Marine Corps specifically. It still failed. On November 24, 1944, with fewer than 100 men left under his command, and the position no longer defensible in any conventional sense, Nakagawa radioed a final brief report back to his division headquarters on Koror, burned his regiment's colors, and took his own life shortly afterward in the traditional manner. His actual final transmission, according to the wartime radio log later recovered and translated by American intelligence, wasn't a lengthy statement of resolve or defiance at all. It was 2 words: Sakura, Sakura, cherry blossoms, the traditional Japanese image for something beautiful, fleeting, and gone almost as soon as it opens. That detail says more honestly what these final Japanese radio messages across the Pacific actually tended to sound like than any of the longer, more quotable lines attributed to other commanders in less carefully sourced retellings of this same war. The last major chapter belongs to Okinawa in the spring of 1945, and to Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, senior staff officer of the Japanese 32nd Army and the architect of its defensive strategy, the highest-ranking Japanese officer to survive that specific battle. Yahara had studied in the United States before the war as an exchange officer, understood his enemy considerably better than most of his own superiors, and argued from the outset against the standard banzai charge doctrine in favor of a deliberate war of attrition, jikusen, designed to bleed the American advance for as long as possible from prepared positions rather than waste his own irreplaceable manpower on doomed frontal assaults. His immediate superior, General Isamu Cho, grew frustrated with what looked from above like passivity and repeatedly pushed for exactly the kind of aggressive counterattacks Yahara's whole doctrine was built to avoid. A genuine internal argument that ran through nearly the entire 3-month battle. One Yahara mostly won, at least in terms of actual operational control, even as it cost him standing with more traditionally minded officers around him. Cho himself was a genuinely difficult figure to reconcile with the rest of this story, a committed nationalist who had reportedly played a role years earlier in the mass killings at Nanjing, and whose confidence in the superiority of Japanese infantry over any opponent remained essentially unbounded, right up until Okinawa proved it wrong in front of him. He and Yahara, according to several post-war accounts, got along reasonably well on a personal level despite the professional argument running underneath nearly every major decision of the campaign, a detail that says something uncomfortable about how easily genuine mutual respect and a catastrophic tactical disagreement can apparently coexist inside the same command tent. When the final Japanese position on Okinawa collapsed that June, the Army's overall commander, General Mitsuru Ushijima, ordered Yahara specifically to escape and report back to Tokyo on what had actually happened, rather than take his own life alongside the rest of the senior staff in the traditional way. Yahara was captured attempting exactly that. Being taken prisoner rather than dying with his command was treated, in the military culture he'd served his entire career inside, as something close to a disgrace, and he spent much of the rest of his life quietly defending that decision, publishing his own detailed memoir of the campaign in Japan in 1972, translated into English more than 2 decades later, offering one of the only genuinely candid senior Japanese staff officer accounts to survive the entire war, precisely because the men who might otherwise have written similar accounts from the other Pacific battles in this story didn't live long enough afterward to do it. What Yahara's own book actually documents, in his own analytical, unemotional staff officer's voice, is less a single dramatic verdict on Marine fighting quality and more a running, 3-month record of trying to find something. Terrain, timing, prepared cave positions, sheer attrition. That would meaningfully slow the specific combination of naval gunfire, close air support, and infantry Yahara found himself facing, and consistently failing to find anything that actually stopped it rather than merely raised its price. That's a quieter kind of testimony than a single quotable line, and it's arguably more honest for exactly that reason. The considered 3-month professional judgment of the one senior officer methodical enough to survive long enough to actually write it down. The ground fight Yahara directed was only ever half of Japan's actual defensive plan for Okinawa. Offshore, in parallel with his own attrition strategy, roughly 1,800 kamikaze sorties were launched against the invasion fleet across the same 3 months, sinking dozens of American ships and killing thousands of sailors in the single costliest naval campaign the U.S. Navy fought in the entire war. A sobering reminder that the ground fighting the story focuses on was never the whole of what Japan threw at that specific invasion, even if it's the half that left the clearest written record of what its own senior officers actually thought while it was happening. The photograph most people associate with all of this, 5 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman raising a flag on Mount Suribachi on February 23, 1945, became one of the defining images of the entire war almost by accident. An unplanned second flag raising photographed because the first, smaller flag had already gone up earlier that same morning, and someone wanted a larger one visible from further away. The 6 men in Joe Rosenthal's frame were Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlan Block, Private First Class Franklin Sousley, Private First Class Ira Hayes, Private First Class Harold Schultz, and Private First Class Harold Keller, a roster the Marine Corps itself got partly wrong for more than 70 years. 2 of the men long identified in official accounts, Navy Corpsman John Bradley and Private First Class René Gagnon, were formally removed from the photograph's roster in 2016 and 2019, respectively, after amateur historians and forensic photo analysts demonstrated they'd actually been present at the earlier first flag raising rather than the more famous second one. A correction the Marine Corps itself eventually accepted and made official, more than 7 decades after the picture was taken. It was taken during an ongoing battle on a volcano whose tunnels and caves were still actively held by Japanese defenders at the moment the shutter clicked. 3 of the 6 men actually in that photograph, Strank, Block, and Sowley, were killed in the fighting that followed in the weeks after it was taken. The image has come to stand for triumph in most popular memory, and that's understandable, but I don't think that's quite what it actually shows if you look at it closely enough. What it shows is a handful of exhausted men in the middle of an unfinished fight, doing a specific job that needed doing in a place still actively trying to kill all of them, treating that fact as simply one more condition to manage rather than a reason to stop, which is close to the exact pattern Japanese officers kept independently describing in island after island and report after report, across 3 years of a war that kept teaching them the same lesson, slightly too late each time to use it. Much of what actually makes this specific story possible to tell with any real documentary confidence comes from a deliberate, decades-long Japanese project, rather than scattered American souvenir hunting through captured paperwork. Beginning in the 1960s, Japan's own National Institute for Defense Studies undertook a systematic effort to compile an official history of the entire war, interviewing surviving veterans of every rank while they were still alive to be interviewed and cross-referencing their recollections against surviving unit diaries, radio logs, and captured American translations of the same documents. The resulting body of work, dense, largely untranslated into English, and still consulted today by military historians on both sides of the Pacific, is where a considerable amount of the specific testimony behind stories like this one ultimately traces back to, including many of the post-war reassessments senior officers like Yahara and Nakagawa's own surviving staff only felt able to put into writing once the war itself and the immediate political pressure to defend it publicly was safely a generation in the past. If you had a relative who served anywhere in the Pacific Theater, Marine, Army, Navy, on either side of any of these islands, I'd genuinely like to hear whatever they told you about it in the comments, because the testimony that actually survives from these campaigns, on both sides, is considerably rarer and more fragile than the record from the European theater, and every family account still out there matters more than it usually gets credited for. What the documented Japanese record actually shows, across Guadalcanal and Tarawa and Peleliu and Iwo Jima and Okinawa, was never a story about superhuman soldiers immune to fear or exhaustion. No training program, however rigorous, has ever managed to engineer that out of any human being, and nothing in the American record suggests Marine Corps training tried to. It's a story about an institution that spent roughly 2 decades solving one specific, narrow problem it had been forced to adopt purely to justify its own continued existence, solving it well enough that when the problem finally arrived for real, across dozens of islands, most of those planners had never heard of in the 1930s. Nobody else on either side of the Pacific was quite as prepared to meet it. Devil dogs was never really a myth. By the documented record left behind by the men who coined it, it was closer to the most precise word they had available for describing a problem they never fully solved, and one that, by the honest admission of the very officers who studied it hardest, they were still trying to properly understand right up until the moment the war itself simply ran out of islands left to test it on.